So we're looking at the individual types of ability tests. So we're now getting into what are the actual constructs that are most often measured in test and assessment. So we're going to start with defining basically intelligence and the history and the current state of measuring intelligence, which includes defining what exactly intelligence is, some of the theories that have driven kind of how we're doing measuring intelligence, and the types of ability tests. So we're going to cover all of those. And in this lecture, we're primarily going to be talking about defining intelligence and the theories of intelligence. So all of us probably have a definition in our minds of what is intelligence, but that really has been the challenge. And I've kind of talked about this before, the idea that in order to make a valid measure, a valid test, a valid assessment of a construct, we need to start with an operational definition of that construct so we know what we're actually trying to measure logically to then drive the process forward. And that's actually been kind of a challenge. When we're talking about the history and the theories of intelligence, it breaks down into two large categories. Basically, single factor theories, theories that basically suggest that there is such a thing as a single construct of intelligence or cognitive ability that can be measured as a unified single measurement, and multifaceted theories of intelligence. It basically says it's inappropriate to create a single score because intelligence is actually a series of constructs. And that debate still rages to this day, but we're going to talk about the history and those theories that have kind of driven where we are at the moment. So what is intelligence? So intelligence is a multifaceted capacity that includes the ability to acquire and apply new knowledge, reason logically, plan effectively, and infer perceptively, grasp and visualize concepts, find the right words and thoughts with facility, and cope with and adjust to novel situations. So right there, that is as succinct as we can get definition, a modern definition, if you will, of intelligence. But you can start to see, think about trying to design an assessment which captures all of this. So we need to capture the ability to acquire and apply knowledge. That's two different constructs. The acquisition of knowledge, how well someone learns, and also how well someone can apply what they learn. So I'm going to use my own self as an example here as we move through this definition, but I am really relatively good at acquiring broad information. I am not very skilled at acquiring specific information. If you asked me to actually list the Roman emperors, I could probably do it in order. If you asked me to actually tell you exactly what date each one took power, how they took power, I could probably give you the how, not the dates. And I might get some of the names slightly wrong, though if we actually looked at the original, I'd be, broadly speaking, correct. But I am really good at applying the knowledge that I have. So again, just looking at those two, I have effectively different subscores. We need to be able to reason logically, plan effectively, and infer perceptively. There again is three different subconstructs. So can we reason? Can we basically create a measure that measures someone's ability to logically reason in a given situation? But additionally, can they use that reasoning to create new plans, and those plans are going to be effective at getting to their goals? And finally, if they're given partial information, can they infer further information from the information they're given? Those are three other things that we need to measure if we were truly trying to get at just this definition of intelligence. We need to be able to grasp and visualize concepts, so basically spatial perception, the ability to understand what we're looking at visually and to be able to then rotate and mentally think about different perspectives of what we're seeing. Need to be able to find the right words and thoughts with facility. And by this point, you're probably fairly used to listening to my lectures, and you know that I don't always find the right word quite immediately. I'll sometimes mispronounce a word. I may sometimes, wait, I actually meant this. That's again an example of probably one of the areas that I'm a little bit lower on my general cognitive ability, is finding the right words. But actually presenting my thoughts coherently, and I hopefully can do so fairly well, and I'm hopefully helping you understand this material. And finally, cope with and adjust to novel situations. So can we actually appreciate mentally and emotionally being in novel or discrete situations, and then can we actually adjust and answer those novel situations? So not just rote responding to problems we've solved before, but addressing new problems. So you can start to see how even this one-page definition of intelligence actually creates quite a challenge for a single factor test to capture all of this. That's why a lot of times when we look at modern intelligence tests, they may try to do all this, or they may actually focus on specific elements that they're wanting to look at. If you'll remember when we were talking about testing in general, one of the examples I gave was an intelligence test that cost over $3,000 and involved all these different tools and techniques. That was again an example of a test that was trying to actually capture this entire definition. And beyond that, intelligence is not limited to this description, and this list should be considered a point of reflection on one's own personal definition. In other words, there's still more to intelligence than what's listed here. So let's talk a little bit about the history of intelligence. So the initial, if you will, hunt for intelligence was mainly focused on a single factor theory. So we go back to someone I've mentioned before, Francis Galton, who wrote the book Hereditary Genius and was very much focused on intelligence as a basis of heredity. So he strongly believed that your genes defined how intelligent you were. Likewise, about the same time and a little later, we actually had Alfred Binet, who is mainly focused at the education of intelligence. So he basically believed that anyone could learn to be a genius if they were given the right education. So we have these two kind of competing theories. R.B. Cattell actually created a unified theory basically suggesting that intelligence was both of these. He basically said that Galton's concepts were fluid intelligence. It's inherited, it's genetically determined, and it involves problem solving, novel responses, and patterns. The ability to recognize patterns, the ability to do spatial perception, the ability to problem solve, and the ability to stay emotionally cool in novel situations was something that he would call fluid intelligence, and he believed that it was hereditary. While R.B. Cattell suggested that there was also crystallized intelligence, mental abilities required through experience and education. For example, the ability to do math, the ability to talk, vocabulary, spelling, all of these he thought were mainly driven by education. So these three figures are kind of setting the stage for a debate that's raged for almost, well, actually over a century at this point. Is intelligence hereditary? Is an education actually, or is intelligence part of education? Or is it a more nuanced combination of the both? So heredity and educational components are measured in most ability tests. So today, modern intelligence tests typically look at both of these components. Different theoretical constructs make it difficult to define these constructs, however. So intelligence tests themselves, if we're actually claiming that we're measuring cognitive ability or intelligence, usually is trying to measure how smart you are compared to the population. And this, again, may involve education and heredity, but generally will focus more on the heredity or the fluid intelligence. In other words, in order to make these tests less culturally biased, there's usually a reduction in the focus on educational components because that may be actually capturing, again, cultural differences. Ability tests are measured by a single factor or G. So again, if we're actually just looking at how someone's ability is as intelligence, think of the GRE. We're often no longer talking about intelligence, we're talking about a factor G. Now, this may seem like an esoteric way to differentiate between intelligence and cognitive ability, but it really is measuring a different thing. Most ability tests are almost completely focused on fluid intelligence, the ability to learn and the ability to adapt to new situations. So if we're giving someone a predictive test of how well they'll do in a novel situation, say an advanced graduate program, we're more interested in not their overall intelligence, but that single factor G. We also have achievement tests and aptitude tests. Achievement tests are basically how well someone actually is likely to achieve in the future and is usually focused on more job relevant or clinically psychology relevant factors. So if we're worried that someone might be having a problem functioning with shapes and spatial perceptions, we might give them a spatial perceptions achievement test or a folding paper test. If we're interested in actually what's their ability to move forward and learn more in this area, we're probably looking at more of an aptitude test. So again, there's an entire body of different types of intelligence tests depending on what we're actually trying to achieve. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the classic theories of intelligence that have driven how we measure this factor. So again, I've already kind of talked about the idea that we really break down the classical theories of intelligence into either single factor or multi-factor theories of intelligence. So Spearman's two-factor theory basically suggested that all measures of mental ability are measuring a single construct or factor, which he referred to as G, which we still use to this day to kind of represent cognitive ability. Additional variance measured by these tests was construct-irrelevant variance. So basically, he said that what we're really interested in is culturally non-relevant, in other words, not cultural, let me back that up, non-biased by culture, our overall ability to adapt and think and basically problem solve. So he was kind of looking at G as a more fluid of intelligence and less of an educational. And a lot of different tests, verbal reasoning, quantitative reasoning, paper folding, pattern analysis, number recall, all are getting at intelligence, but according to him, they also were getting additional factors. What we're actually interested in, according to him, is not the error and not the educational component, but the actual aptitude or ability of the person to learn, to interpret, and to learn more in these factors. So of the classical theory, Spearman's two-factor theory, basically the two factors are what we're measuring and what we don't want to be measuring. And his focus was on a unified single measure of G that we should be measuring. Thurstone's primary mental abilities, measures of mental abilities are measuring separate constructs. So Thurston is the first person that really put forward a theory that said it's inappropriate to try to break these out into a single score. And we still see examples of Thurston's primary mental abilities in a lot of scores that we get. For example, in the GRE, the Graduate Records Exam, though you do get an overall score, it's strongly suggested that you actually look at the different subscores when you're trying to determine how well someone does. Now, this isn't based solely on Thurston's primary mental abilities, but you can see the idea of this kind of classical theory of there being multiple factors. Originally, there were 9 factors, but many tests only use 5, and there also is a fair amount of inconsistency. But what he suggested basically was that there was different factors. There's creativity, there's speed, there's memory, there's attention, there's focus, there's flexibility, and all of these are sub-factors. And the smarter you are, the more likely you're good at multiples of these and are strong in multiples of these areas. He suggested that, for example, the broad categories included verbal, spatial, and memory, but within verbal, we have both reading comprehension and vocabulary. In spatial, we have pattern analysis and paper folding skills. And in memory, we have number recall or even word recall. So again, we start to get an idea of a theory that's focused on not one overall score, but sub-scores that can tell us more information about the person's general ability and may also be more useful at determining how they do. For example, someone that's very high on spatial but low on verbal might do very well in a drafting class. But someone that's high in verbal and low on spatial may do very well in a literature class. This is the kind of information that Thurston was really focused on giving us. In other words, a nuanced view of who's going to do well in various situations. And this is also what has driven a lot of assessments in the workplace. The idea of if you're going to measure intelligence, you're probably not interested in general cognitive ability. You're probably interested in sub-scores that are directly related to doing the job. So Carroll in 1997 suggested a 3-stratum theory of cognitive ability, and basically he suggested that the overall first stratum is G. The measurement of an overall cognitive ability is still valid, but within it, there is then a sub-level which contains crystallized and fluid intelligence, what he called GC and GF. Crystallized intelligence, again, includes acquired skills and knowledge that are dependent on exposure to a particular culture, as well as formal and informal education. And fluid intelligence is nonverbal, relatively cultural free, and independent of specific instruction. In other words, one of the ways that he was suggesting was that you start with a genetic component, fluid intelligence. And that's basically your set point, if you will. If you're then exposed to a really good educational system, a positive environment that helps you learn, you're actually going to exceed your set point of fluid intelligence. If you have a certain fluid intelligence and you're actually submitted to a very poor environment, very few opportunities to learn, you're actually probably going to be below your set point in your overall ability to function. And finally, there is a varying, underneath that is varying level factors such as speed, rate, etc., all of these other particularly types of tests. So basically, he's suggesting there's 3 layers of testing. We can test overall G, we can test crystalline versus fluid intelligence, or we can get into the subcategories beyond that that are specific to very specific questions. For example, spatial motor skills. So our modern theories of intelligence are basically based around this idea of combining the two into what is called a hierarchical model, combining both single and multiple factors. So almost all modern intelligence tests do have an overall score, which combines all of the multiple factors. So we have the highest level of the hierarchical model, intelligence. Underneath it is usually going to be crystallized intelligence, fluid intelligence, might be short-term memory, depends again on the test. Different tests are going to have different terms for these, but we're going to see a very similar layer. And then below that is the actual subcategories of constructs that make up these various mid-levels. Verbal reasoning and quantitative reasoning may be crystallized, pattern analysis and paper folding, for instance, might be fluid, and memory for objects and number recall might be short-term memory, for instance. Now, these again are just examples. There's many, many different types of tests that can fit into these kind of models depending on what you're actually interested in measuring. So the modern theories of intelligence, these hierarchical models do not solve the theoretical argument between factors of intelligence. Different ability tests use different measures to access different subfactors. In other words, we are not at a point where intelligence has been perfectly defined yet. Where we are is we have a theory of kind of matching what we're measuring to the question that we're asking. So in some ways, we actually are still at a level where there's not an overall theory of intelligence. There's multiple theories of intelligence. And when we're looking at a test, a measure, or an assessment, we're usually looking to see, does it actually match what we're interested in measuring at the time? So for example, I have some of the lists here as far as the Woodcock-Johnson's, for instance, which is a standardized intelligence test, which actually measures multiple aspects, compared to the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, which is another highly often used measure of modern intelligence. Notice that we have different terms. So Woodcock-Johnson calls it comprehension knowledge. The Wechsler Adult calls it verbal comprehension. We also have long-term memory versus working memory. We have fluid reasoning and short-term memory and auditory processing versus processing speed, which is in both. We have long-term memory versus working memory. Each one is looking at different things, but again, you can kind of see they're trying to create an overall model, if you will, based on what they're actually trying to measure. So theory and intelligence development and interpretation. How intelligence is measured is largely dependent on the examiner's conceptualization of intelligence. Like with all assessments and measures and tests, it starts with our operational definition. How are we defining intelligence, and what is the problem or solution that we're trying to address with this assessment? Are we simply trying to determine if someone is within a normal operating range of intelligence? We might be looking at a single dimension at that point. Are we actually trying to fully define what they will be good at and what they may have challenges with? We might be looking at multiple dimensions. If we're looking at actual employment, we might be trying to match what we're measuring to what the job actually entails. And again, most of these models are now involving both nature and nurture. Nature being the genetic component and nurture being the learning, the environment, the education. Generally speaking, there's also a little bit of a discussion on, is intelligence stable or malleable? So for the most part, most of the research has shown that, like most of the constructs we're interested in measuring, intelligence tends to be relatively stable over time. However, there is a fair amount of information that says that basically crystalline intelligence, or that which we learn, can be malleable. We can take someone and really build on what they are capable of with that nurture component. So again, there's no one answer to this. So finally, let's just talk about some of the issues. And again, when we're talking about theories of intelligence, the nature versus nurture, the research literature does support environmental arguments of the hereditary environment debate, but it also supports the hereditary. For example, identical twins, when rooted apart, still share similar intelligence test scores on most of these tests. Now realize this also can be a little bit of which came first, the chicken or the egg. So we've created intelligence tests, and we find that these intelligence tests basically show a little difference with identical twins that should have the same genetic materials when they've been reared in different environments. But that also may simply indicate that those particular tests are sampling heavily from what we consider to be fluid intelligence. Another example of this is kind of the testing issue. So this is going to vary a little bit into animal testing, but one of the areas that really has been happening at the same time as we try to identify and define intelligence in people is how we define and measure intelligence in animals. And one of the common tests that is used is a self-perception test. Basically, you take an animal, and while it's unconscious, you put a dot on its face. For example, a great ape. And then when it wakes up, you present it with a mirror. And the idea is that if it looks in the mirror, sees the dot, recognizes that the dot shouldn't be there, and tries to scratch it off, for example, with their hand or their digit or their paw or their hoof, we infer that that means that they're self-aware. They recognize that that image in the mirror is them. And that's one of our actual measures of intelligence within animals. So for example, great apes pass this test, and so do elephants. However, and also dolphins. But some of the animals that don't include cats, dogs, horses, other animals that we think may have similar, maybe not as strong, but at least some intelligence. A recent research study actually reversed this process and said, we're asking animals that aren't necessarily focused on vision to recognize a visionary clue in a mirror as them. They've reset up the experiment to where instead they were presented with a series of smells that mirrored their smells with a new smell added to them. The animals, specifically horses and dogs, actually responded positively and showed a knowledge that the smell signature they were getting was representing themselves, and there was something that didn't fit. And they quickly found that smell and started to try to remove it, which indicates that in this case, it was a testing error. We had tested based on sight because we live our lives based on vision. And most of the animals that were relatively smart that were passing this test using a mirror, using vision, were also animals that tended to focus their vision forward. They were predators or omnivores that used vision. When we used this test for animals that were more scent-based, they were not passing this test. So that's just a quick little kind of story, if you will, about there's always going to be issues in how we measure things, because sometimes the way we're measuring things are based on our own personal experiences, our assumptions. So today, most behavioral scientists believe that measured intelligence, intellectual ability, represents an interaction between innate ability and environmental influences. Interactionist models suggest that people inherit a certain intellectual potential, or set point, which then depends on the type of environment in which it is nurtured. And this is the same in most things. Whenever we find a component in human behavior that has a hereditary or a gene-based component, that usually provides our set point, not necessarily our outcome, because it's an interaction between that genetic set point and the environment we're in. A good example of this, for instance, was one time I was watching an interview with Arnold Schwarzenegger, and he was asked, can anyone be a world champion bodybuilder? And he laughed and said, no. I was very lucky that I had the right genes, and I then did everything necessary to maximize where I was. That doesn't mean that people can't be better than they are. But the thought that anyone can be at the very top of this profession, that's just ridiculous. It's muscle tone, it's amount of muscle mass that you start with, it's skeletal structure, it's size. All of those are factors. However, anyone can gain muscle depending on their environment.